Okay, so the last round of tools here that we're going to go over before we get into more mark making practices of Photoshop are these tools here. So the blur, the sharpen, and the smudge tool, right? So these are really good tools for using on photographs where you want to isolate areas that you might want to blur or sharpen or smudge, and I'll show you what that means. So unlike the other three tools, the dodge, the burn, and the sponge tool, these tools here, the blur, sharpen, and smudge, these are non-destructive. You can put these on a new layer and turn them on or off, so it's quite nice. But they do kind of exactly what they're labeled, right? So the blur tool, that looks like this little water droplet here, will allow you to selectively isolate an area and blur this. So the way that we did this before is we made a selection and then we came up to filter and then filter gallery, right? Or you could come to blur and you could apply a filter and do it this way. But if you wanted some more just manual spot control, this is how you would do it. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to unlock this and I'm going to create a new layer, right? A new layer on top. And with my blur tool selected, right, and with the brush, I'm going to just use a soft round and make sure I have kind of a soft edge there. It has some different modes here. You can play around with these as you'd like and select different aspects you'd like to blur, but let's just keep this on normal for now. And then the strength, that's how intense that change of blur is going to be. But this is what I want you to make sure you have on. So sample all layers. If you're on a new layer, that's what you would want to do, right? If you want this to be a non-destructive way of doing it. And sometimes it's hard to see with an image like this, right? Let's just say I have this car that I really want to be the focal point, which that's why a blur tool could be helpful. It could help emphasize this and add in some what we would call like some artificial bokeh, right? We would blur that background a little bit, but make sure with the new layer on, let's just come in with the blur tool and let's just click and just kind of move things around, and right, you can see it could take a little bit, right? It's kind of hard to see, but this is where having that layer can be helpful because then that will allow you to turn it on or off, and you can kind of see what it looks like. And this can take some time, but notice in the layer here we can see that it is being isolated to that layer, right? That blurring is being applied right on top. And if I wanted to see, right, what the image looks like, we can see, right? I've added in some nice blur there. I can turn that on or off. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of just blur out a lot of this background. Okay, and I'll leave these cobblestones in front. And maybe I'll come in, I'll blur just a little bit in here. Right, and I'm trying to replicate kind of a shallow depth of field, right, where I just have kind of a focused area, right? And you could spend more time doing this than what I'm doing here. And right, again, if I want to see what that looks like, I could come in here and I could turn that on or off. And the same thing for sharpen. If I come into Sharpen Tool, now this will not sharpen a blurry image the way that you think it might. What it's doing is it's looking for contrast and it's looking for edges, and then it will intensify that contrast. So it can give the illusion that it's sharpening things up, but don't think that the Sharpen tool will help put into focus a badly taken photograph. And let me show you what I mean by contrast and edges. So with the Sharpen tool and still on a new layer, if I come into the car and let's just say, right, make sure sample all layers is on, normal strength, I'm going to turn this up just for effect so you can see it, right? And then protect detail, usually you'd want that on, but that can help you with maintaining an image that looks like it's being sharpened like naturally. And you'll see that as you start to sharpen things up, the more and more you do it, it can get kind of funky looking and get really pixelated, and you might see some really, really hard edges. So that's what that is going to be doing. But let's come in here and let's just show you. So if I click, right, And again, sometimes it's hard to tell if it's doing anything because it works in these small increments, but you should notice that contrast in that grill plate already kind of popping out quite a bit, right? And if you need to see it, right, if you want to see it, let's, what Photoshop is thinking and rendering here, but we would turn this eye off and then you could see that the sharpness, right? If I turn this off, right, we can see that. And I kind of went a little bit overboard. You can see it's a little bit grainy here. So I kind of did a bit too much. But, you know, if you come out a little bit, we can see that it doesn't look too bad there, right? We've added in some contrast, right? So these two things, right, blur and sharpen, you're going to be just kind of playing with on the next image, on this tiger image here. And before that, I'll go over the last tool here, and this is your smudge tool. I don't use this too often. We're going to be getting into some more mark making things. I'll show you the liquefy panel, and we'll do more things with brushes. And what this does is it does kind of exactly what it says. It smudges, right? So if I wanted to, and depending on your processor, right, this kind of slows things down a little bit, at least for me. But what this will do is if I just click and kind of drag, right? Let me see. Let me delete this layer. Okay. And just for effect, I'm going to turn this all the way up, right? And what this will do, right? It's smudging, right? Just what it says it does. Okay. This can be useful on text if you wanted to kind of show text that has the illusion of movement or something. And if you can create kind of straight line smudges. So wherever I left off that last place, if I just hold shift and then click, right, you can kind of get this cool effect where it will go in a linear fashion from wherever you were, right? And if I hold shift down, if I'm holding shift and I move around, it will keep it in line with whatever pattern I started or whatever direction I started in, right? So if I hold shift and move to the right, it'll keep that a nice horizontal line. If I hold shift and go to a diagonal, it'll keep that going. So I mean, I don't, like I said, I don't use this too often, but it can be fun to play around with, especially if we're doing, right, our more creative imagery or actually making abstract digital paintings or something, then that would be beneficial. And then if you click finger painting, what that'll do is it will simulate adding a foreground color every time I make a smudge. So right now I have this brown picked, but let me choose something that pops out a bit more. So I have this red picked now. So if I smudge now, oh, too much. Let me turn that down. So what it'll do now is it'll add just a little bit of that maroonish color every time I make a smudge, right? To basically just simulate what that, if that paint were to remain on my fingertip, what it would look like every time I smudge the image. I would just be adding a little bit of that maroon every time. Okay. Yeah, so again, you can see my computer slowing down a bit, right? But let me, and these, again, so the smudge tool works on it. I wasn't doing it there, but I could be on a new layer. Just make sure you had sample all layers, and then you could come in here and click and move things around, and you could turn that off if I wanted to see, right? If you notice the wheel here, right? If I have it on its own layer, I can turn that on or off. Okay, so with those three tools, okay, your last weekly exercise here is, what I'd like you to do here is I'd like you to use the blur and the sharpen tool. So the blur tool, I'd like you to blur the background. The sharpen tool, I'd have you sharpen the tigers. And then using the smudge tool, maybe just take your own creative liberties here and see if you can maybe get that background to look a bit more, more like a I don't know, a softer digital painting there. But use those three tools at your own kind of discretion, but that's the way I would do it, is blur the background, sharpen those tigers, and just to get a sense of how that smudge tool works, let's use that in the background there and just play around and get a feel for this image here. Okay, so those three exercises you have, so you have the dodge, the burn, the sponge tool exercise, the eraser exercise, and now the blur, sharpen, and smudge exercise. Okay,